As many of my Daisy Cakes know, I recently compiled a list of the top 100 science fiction authors. I am releasing them in alphabetical order, 10 at a time. If you haven't seen the first video, I'll link it up here. But I've also curated a list of the top 100 fantasy authors. Why? Because I am Daisy Ex Machina, the drag queen detective who investigates all things speculative in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Now, no author will be repeated in both the science fiction and fantasy list, and I'll include classic authors and modern authors, and even authors who write in juvenile and young adult books. The only limit is they are authors that I've read and liked, and I haven't read every science fiction and fantasy author in existence, but I think these lists are pretty wide-ranging and eclectic. So let's get started with the top 100 fantasy authors, starting with the first 10 in alphabetical order. Can you guess who will be first on the list? Yes? No? I'll put you out of your misery. Of course, it's Joe Abercrombie. He is the British fantasy author born in 1974, best known for the trilogy I'm recommending, the First Law trilogy, which starts with The Blade itself, published in 2006, continues with Before They Are Hanged, published in 2007, and concludes with The Last Argument of Kings, published in 2008. Now, I was a little late coming to the Abercrombie novels, mostly, I think, because the covers were a little bland, but I kept hearing so much about Abercrombie, I finally got the whole series in 2014, and I loved it. It's about a war between three factions, the Union, the Gurkish Empire, and the Northern Kingdom. There are a whole lot of POV characters, but what sets Abercrombie apart, I think, is the prose. There's a literary quality to his writing, kind of like Rothfuss. If you like dark fantasy, if you like a little military fantasy, if you're a fan of Glenn Cook's Dark Company series, you'll probably really enjoy Abercrombie. Now, I ended up cheating a little bit with the next author, and I didn't realize it because half of him is in the top 100 science fiction authors, and I didn't want to have any repeats. The reason being is that he is one half of the author known as James S.A. Corey, which is the pen name of Daniel Abraham and Ty Frank. Now, I didn't realize when I compiled the list and put Daniel Abraham as a must-read fantasy author that he was also part of the James S.A. Corey duo. But I think we're safe because it's not an exact match. Abraham was born in 1969 and is also associated with George R.R. Martin, who he's collaborated with and helped adapt Game of Thrones as a graphic novel. What I recommend, however, is The Long Price Quartet, a 4-book series which began with A Shadow in Summer, published in 2006. And then there's a publication every following year, A Betrayal in Winter, An Autumn War, and The Price of Spring. Like Abercrombie, the fantasy here is a bit dark, a bit military. It's about the enlightened city-state of Saraket, which is run by this poet-sorceress, and the Empire of the Gaults, which is an expansion nation of barbarian invaders. And I always wondered if they're named after John Galt. Anyway, an excellent series that I highly recommend. Now we're going to change course quite a bit with Richard Adams, who you may recognize as the author of Watership Down. Adams was born in 1920 and passed away at the age of 96 in 2016. If you haven't heard of Watership Down, published in 1972, it's a novel about anthropomorphized rabbits. Was it written for adults or kids? I don't know, but it has become one of the seminal novels that many of us grew up with. But I'm going to go recommend a completely different novel he wrote, Maya, published in 1984, and this is definitely not a kid's book. It's set in the Beckland Empire, which is kind of this fictional Mesopotamian-like empire, and follows the life of Maya, a young woman who starts off as a slave and rises up to be the Sarah Linda, who people treat as a demigoddess. This is a book way before its time. There's some Jacqueline Carey sadomasochistic explorations in different types of relationships. And I guess there are going to be trigger warnings, and if that's an issue, look those up. But it's one of those books that has stuck with me since the 80s. I read it with my best friend, Sean, and we still talk about it to this day. It's one of those books. Going back to more regular fantasy fare, we have Katherine Addison, which is the pen name of Sarah Monette. She's published under both names, but my recommendation is published under Katherine Addison, and that is for The Goblin Emperor, published in 2014. It won the Locus Award for Best Fantasy and was nominated for the Nebula Hugo and World Fantasy Award. It's such a neat twist on fairy or fae tropes. Funny enough, and I swear I didn't plan this, but the main character is named Maya, spelled exactly like the Richard Adams book I just recommended. Maya here is the son of an elvish emperor who took a goblin wife for political reasons, so Maya is half elf, half goblin, and he pretty much lives in exile because everyone is slightly ashamed of him, and his half-brothers, who are full elves, are expected to be the heirs of the kingdom. But for reasons, Maya suddenly finds himself whisked out of exile and raised up to be the emperor, aka the Goblin Emperor. Not many elves are happy about this. It's really a great fun story that I think you should definitely check out. Now let's move on to an oldie, Piers Anthony. Anthony was born in 1934 and died just a few years ago in 2019 at the age of 89. Piers Anthony was an extremely prolific writer who started out as a science fiction writer. His first novel, Chthon, which I think is a pretty decent science fiction novel published in 1967, was nominated for a Hugo and a Nebula. But his claim to fame really came during the fantasy renaissance of the late 70s with A Spell for Chameleon, published in 1977. The first novel in his Xanth world. Xanth is a pun-heavy alternate dimension, and this dimension lives next to ours. I loved Spell for Chameleon and recommend it as part of a trilogy along with The Source of Magic and Castle Rugna. You probably don't need to go further than that, but if you really like Xanth, there are almost 50 Xanth novels. I personally think they get a little bit silly and repetitive, but your mileage may vary. By the way, this was definitely an adult fantasy, but I think because of the puns and the silliness of the books, it has gotten the reputation of being kids' books. And just as a little bit of a warning, the female characters have been accused of being problematic. I never really got that, but it may bother you. Another Piers Anthony series, which I liked even more than Xanth, is the Split Infinity series, the first book published in 1980, which is kind of a fantasy science fiction mashup, being there's two dimensions side by side, a world of magic and a world of science, and there's some crossovers during this weird game. I could go on and on about Piers Anthony since I read quite a lot of his works, but I think I'll stop here. The next author is one who I really think deserves more recognition, and that is Sarah Ashe, a British fantasy author with a fantastic series that I highly recommend called The Tears of Ardamon. The first novel in the trilogy is The Lord of Snow and Shadow, published in 2003, followed by The Prisoner of the Iron Tower, published in 2004, and Children of the Serpent's Gate, published in 2005. Here is a copy of it. And you know I really love this series because this is in hardback and I prefer books in paperback. So when you see me with the hardback book, that means I couldn't wait for the paperback to come out. Now, this series has some familiar fantasy tropes. A boy raised modestly by a single mother finds out he has a secret legacy. There are dragons and ghosts. The fate of kingdoms swings in the balance, but even though it trods familiar ground, there's something about Ash's style or the twist she puts in her plot that give the story a really unique spin. If you like epic fantasy trilogies, I think you'll love The Tears of Artemon. Now we're going to go back in time once again to this next author because this is another one I absolutely loved in my younger days. Robert Lynn Asprin, born in 1946, died relatively young at the age of 61 in 2008, and died allegedly holding a Terry Pratchett book. Asprin was really a darling of the D&D crowd in the 70s and 80s, aka especially with his Thieves' World books. But the books I love is his myth adventure novels, starting with Another Fine Myth, published in 1978, which started a very long-running series, which includes myth conceptions, myth directions, myth fits. You get the idea. They're about a kind of bumbling young magician named Skeeve who manages to summon a powerful demon named Oz. And these are funny little adventures with Skeeve and Oz, and if you're looking for fantasy humor, you can't go wrong with the Myth Adventure series by Robert Asprin. So we're moving on from the A's to the B's in this alphabetical list, and I have a very recent author, at least at the time of filming this video, who's next on the list, Travis Baldree, whose novel Legends and Lattes, published in 2022, has become a bit of a legend unto itself, maybe even starting a new subgenre of fantasy. At least I never heard the term cozy fantasy until Legends and Lattes, which is a light but very heartwarming story of a woman orc warrior who retires to open a coffee shop in a small town that has never heard of coffee. The publication history of Legends and Lattes is a true Cinderella story, as it was first indie published, received such huge praise and sales that eventually Baldree was courted by traditional publishers and went on to be nominated for a Hugo and Nebula. Now this is an author to keep an eye on. I may get some blowback about this next author because he is known primarily as a horror writer, but I don't care. It's Clive Barker, one of my favorite authors of all time. I've been reading him since his books of blood, but my personal favorite of all of Barker's works are what I consider to be contemporary dark fantasy. The first is Weave World, published in 1987, about a magic carpet created by a race of magicians that opens up to another world. Tell me that's not fantasy. The second novel is Imagica, published in 1991, which is Clive Barker's magnum opus, which he, I believe, allegedly wrote on hallucinogens, and is about a secret war that spans across many parallel dimensions. Again, fantasy, but yes, also elements of horror. And if it bothers you, there's usually graphic sex in Barker's writings. And even though you'll find both of these books in the horror sections, I'll die on the hill that these are both magnificent works of contemporary fantasy. Twisted, dark contemporary fantasy, but fantasy nonetheless. The final author to round out the first 10 of the top 100 fantasy authors couldn't be further from Clive Barker, because I am talking about Kelly Barnhill, the children's author who wrote one of my favorite juvenile fantasies in at least modern times, The Girl Who Drank the Moon, published in 2016, which went on to win a Newbery Medal, which is the most prestigious award in children's literature. She also wrote the much acclaimed adult fantasy When Women Were Dragons, published in 2022, but I haven't read that one yet, so I can't say anything about it. If you've read it, let me know what you thought about it down in the comments. And while you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Anyway, I want to talk about The Girl Who Drank the Moon because it is so good. It's one of those children's books that I think adults would love. It's written like a fairy tale, but the funny and bittersweet premise is that it's set in this town who is scared of a witch who lives in the woods because the witch eats babies. So every year they leave a baby out in the woods to appease her. But guess what? The witch doesn't eat babies. She's a wonderful person, and she takes the babies, feeds them starlight, and finds homes for them. But one of the babies she accidentally feeds moonlight. So baby girl, and this infuses the baby with magic, so the witch has to raise the girl, who she names Luna, as her own because of all these magic powers she now has. The story is funny and heartfelt, and the main character, Luna, you can't help but love her. Her best friends are a dragon and a swamp monster. Mostly, though, it is the writing that stands out. At least for me, that's where the magic really is. So that ends the first 10 authors in my top 100 fantasy authors list. Were there any surprises? Were there any you would not have included? Let me know down in the comments. Until we meet again, may all the books you read be blessed.